And we are live on Energy Superheroes. I'm excited today to have Chris DeArmitt. Chris is a plastic materials consultant. He spent some time at BASF, so he really knows his stuff on plastics. Chris is also an environmental expert, an author. He's written a book. He's an award winning speaker and a class action expert witness, which I know once it goes into the courtroom, you have to have a greater level of expertise. So, we're really happy to have Chris today. We're going to learn some truth about plastics that I don't think a lot of people know. Chris has read the science and he brings a totally fresh perspective to this topic. What I'd like to learn today from you, Chris, is tell us about your journey and your current thinking on plastics, because I think the audience hasn't heard a lot of the things that you're going to tell us today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Peter. The first thing I'd like to say is you mentioned the class action expert witness. And the thing about being in a courtroom is having evidence, right? That's the key thing. How do we know what's true and what isn't true? Who has the best evidence? And we also have two sides, right? We have the prosecutor who alleges things, and we have the defender who comes up with contrary evidence. At the moment, what I see is we've only really heard the prosecution when it comes to plastics. We hear the attacks all the time, and there's been little to no, I don't want to say defense because I don't want to defend plastics, but we've had little to no pushback of people showing the evidence from the other side. And so what I've done is my journey began when my kids came home from school. They've been taught clear lies at school, right? So I'm paying property tax to send my kids to a good school and having them taught absolute whoppers, right? Things which are just black and white wrong. And that made me angry. And I started on this journey, which kind of got out of control. I've now read about 3,000 scientific articles. And as far as I can work out, I'm the only one who's actually seen the evidence. I'm the only one who's bothered to read about materials and then waste and litter, microplastics, ocean plastics, harm to marine animals. I don't think anyone else has been stupid enough to cover all of the topics to really get a picture of what's going on.
So, with all that analysis, what would you say is the number one thing that you've learned that is just mind blowing or different from what the mainstream perspective is that people, let's say, parrot that you hear everywhere? What's the biggest difference that you discovered?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One shocking thing is that plastic is 0.5% of all the materials we use and all the waste we create. So people are basically ignoring 99.5% of our problem and they're just having so much fun obsessing about plastics that they're ignoring 99.5% of the problem. It would be like calling the fire brigade because your house is on fire. The fireman shows up and decides to put out some guy smoking a cigarette, decides to put out the cigarette and ignore the house on fire. This is what we're doing now. It's not to distract from the plastics, but it's just to say that as a problem solver, I know there's no way to solve a problem when you're ignoring 99.5% of it. But that's one thing that I found that was shocking. And another thing is that basically our environmental groups are the biggest cause of this problem. They're just spreading information which is untrue and getting rich from it. And so that was a revelation to me that the people we're trusting for information have let us down. They've basically changed sides and they're just out for their own personal enrichment. And there's a book to that effect. If you look at this book, Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, that's by one of the founders of Greenpeace, Dr. Patrick Moore. He left and said, all they're doing is making up stuff to get your funding, to get your donations. And that's all they're doing. They've abandoned the environment, according to him.
Interesting. So, if plastic is half of 1% of the problem, what is the biggest, let's say, of the other 99.5%? What do you see as the big problem?
So concrete is the biggest. It's like 10 billion tons a year compared to zero point 0.4 billion for plastic. So we're always talking about these big numbers. People show you big numbers. We use this much plastic and CO2 and fossil fuel. They always show you these big numbers, but they don't mean anything to our human brains without context. You always have to say, compared to what? And Thomas Sowell's a famous economist who has a lot of respect around the world. He's over 90 now. And he said, when you hear something that sounds like a good idea, ask yourself, compared to what? Where's the evidence and how much will it cost? And so these are the things we have to do when we hear an allegation about something or we hear an proposed alternative. We have to ask ourselves, look at the perspective and compare it and see how it fits into the big picture.
And no, that makes sense. So, concrete is a big one. Of course, we like to talk about the big four on this show, which we say is concrete, plastic, steel, and ammonia, which are
Okay.
essential materials that we need in the modern world in order to live. I think it's interesting that concrete is one of those. I know steel is a big one. I've also heard an interesting perspective that the real estate industry is the number one contributor to G's and waste because of how much concrete they use. So,
Yeah.
it sort of fits in with the research that you've done. On plastics specifically, there was an article in Barron's this weekend and it focused, I think it was well put together, but it does focus on the challenge with plastics ending up in the ocean. And I
Mm.
know that this is something that people care a lot about. So, what has your research told you about that?
Yeah, so there is no floating island of plastic the size of Texas. That's just sheer fiction, right? You can literally, the guy who discovered the patches, right? They ask him, the journalist asks him all the time, take me out to the patches. I want to take a picture of this mountain of material. He says, there's nothing to see there, right? You can swim right through these patches and not even know you're in one because there's so little plastic. So the numbers are there, right? They've been going up and down with nets for years. They know exactly how much plastic is there. And there are areas with more plastic than there is on average in the ocean because of the way things swirl around. But there are no floating islands of plastic. And what is there is up to 85% fishing gear. So if we were worried about plastic in the ocean, and of course there shouldn't be plastic in the ocean, it's pollution shouldn't be there and it's there because fishing vessels are dumping their nets and leaving all of their other stuff. That's the main cause. And that's when we come back to again, right? As a problem solver, I know you can't solve a problem if you haven't diagnosed it properly. It'd be like the doctor thinks he can fix you. He looks at without even examining you. That's what we're doing now. We're basically trying to solve problems without checking to see what the data is first. And we have the data. All the data is published that we could possibly need about what plastic is where. Another thing, we were told we'll have more plastic than fish in the ocean by 2050. And Ellen MacArthur Foundation said that. And it's been debunked like again and again. It's just not true. It's just not even close to true. So it was based on an idea that we dump 10 tons of plastic in the ocean per year, right? This is coming from rivers. And that was a guess by Jambeck. They basically said, imagine how much plastic is within 35 miles of the ocean. And we'll imagine 2% of that jumps into the ocean by itself. That's the calculation, right? With no evidence. There was no data behind it. And still everyone's quoting this 8 to 10 million tons number. The latest scientific paper, based on decades of actual data, is 6,000 tons of microplastic going into the oceans from rivers every year, not 10 million tons. And nobody's updated the World Wildlife Fund, the Ellen MacArthur, nobody updates their web pages when the latest research comes out with a lower number. And you have to ask yourself why. If they're genuinely concerned about the environment, why wouldn't they be interested in the new correct number instead of the wildly incorrect old guess?
I got you. So the majority of the plastic in the ocean comes from fishing industry. What about the single use plastic? So people say, okay, bottle of water, single use plastics. Is that not ending up in the ocean? Or is it ending up in? I know I recycle all of my bottles of water. I drop them in the recycling bin. So
Yeah.
I always wondered about that. But how does this kind of single use plastic end up in the water? Is it in other countries where they just throw it in rivers, or how does that come about?
Yeah. There's multiple answers to that. So the first thing to know is what's the blame, right? Let's say that my kid dropped a plastic bottle or a Coke can on the floor, right? If they were to blame that can, I would send them to their room, right, with no dinner, right? That would be a hideous distortion of the truth. Even a child knows that when they drop litter on the floor, it's not the fault of the metal or the paper or the glass or whatever, right? You'd have to be either insane or incredibly stupid or corrupt to believe that. And yet that's what we're being told. We're being told that Coca-Cola's the second biggest polluter in the world of plastic. Is no, their customers may be dropping stuff, but to blame the material or the company is just wrong. It's just, and people say, how can you blame the customer? It's like, we should blame the people who are to blame, right? There's nothing wrong with blaming the people who are to blame. That's the only way to solve things. And they've done scientific studies that 81% of litter is dropped intentionally. They literally watch hundreds of thousands of events of people dropping their stuff on the floor. And then to turn around and blame the stuff is just preposterous. And yet that's what they're doing. So that's one part of it, that the blame is with the people and human behavior. And once you know that, you can fix it. We know the ways to fix littering. It's education, deposit system so that the stuff is too expensive now to drop it on the floor, and fines. That's how you fix it because it's down to human behavior and the solution is with human behavior. When it comes to what's actually on the beaches and so forth, people have been misled about that because they've done studies and they've worked out where is this beach litter coming from. The beach, you go to a tourist beach and the stuff is coming from the tourists on the beach, right? You see a littered beach and you assume that beaches all over the world look like that. And that's not the case. When scientists go to non-tourist beaches, ones which are inaccessible and you can't get to them as easily, they don't find that. They find all the fishing gear. They don't find the Coke bottles. They don't find the kebab sticks and the other things and the cigarette butts and so forth. They find a few, but very few of them. So that's another example of how our perception's been distorted because by definition, tourists are going to tourist beaches, right? They're not going to remote, inaccessible beaches where people are unable to drop their litter on the floor.
I gotcha. So maybe a better solution is like in the old days, you used to get 5 cents if you'll bring the Coke bottle in. So you have Of course, as we learned with COVID, you have carrots and sticks, right, to human behavior. We heard a lot of discussion around that. A lot of it, of course, I think in that instance may have been misplaced. However, when it comes to litter, you want to have good carrots and sticks. So is that what you mean when it comes to trying to encourage people to take more responsibility for their own actions?
Yeah, that's it. I can't stand this argument. Oh, you shouldn't blame the customer. No, you should blame the person who is to blame. If I shoot somebody, they don't put my neighbor in jail. That's what it's just injustice. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't solve anything. You have to work out what the cause is and then address it. And it's been scientifically proven people cause litter and that the solutions lie with the people and their behavior.
Understand. So the current reality is that people are littering, right? So it's a problem. Is there a difference, say, or is it worse if somebody litters with plastic versus if they litter with paper?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. People always say, oh, plastic is bad. We should move to something else like paper or whatever. There's no evidence to suggest that people would drop the paper less or the aluminum can. And when you look at the degradation rates of these materials, plastic degrades faster than almost all material we use. It degrades faster than concrete and ceramic and glass. It degrades faster than metals. It degrades at about the same pace as a piece of paper. If you analyze it under different conditions, wet and dry and outdoors and indoors and so forth, paper takes over 2,000 years to degrade if you leave it just indoors in the dry, right? And we've got paper that's over 1,000 years old that you can still read. And nobody's saying that we should ban paper based on that, right? And yet when it comes to plastic, it's, oh, this plastic doesn't degrade immediately. We need to ban it because of that. And that's illogical. In fact, there's 3 peer-reviewed studies on plastic bags, and they all show that they degrade outdoors and disappear within less than a year. It makes you wonder why the World Wildlife Fund and all these other organizations have these graphics showing that it takes 450 years for plastic to degrade when it's just untrue. There's never been a scientific publication that I can find in the history of the world that said that plastics last that long. And if you were to go to Home Depot and say, hey, give me some plastic that's guaranteed to last 500 years, they'd laugh in your face. They'd laugh you out of the store, right? Everyone knows that plastic degrades. We see it every day. And yet when the World Wildlife Fund tells it to us again and again, we somehow believe it. And I tried to work out where this myth came from about plastic degradation, and it came from this book, Environmental Hazards, Marine Pollution. On page 8, this Martha Gorman woman just made it up. There's no citation. She just said plastics take hundreds of years to degrade with no scientific citation, no evidence, and everyone just parroted that for the last 30 years.
Also, I think about logically, right? I'm a boater. So I think about if I were to drop piece of paper in the water, I feel like the water washes over it. And I feel like there is just some kind of dissipation of the paper. Whereas
Yeah,
if I drop a piece of plastic in the water, it floats there and it's obvious that it's there.
yeah.
So I think that's where it seems that just logically that paper degrades faster in water than plastic.
In water, it does fall apart, but the interesting thing is it forms microparticles, right? And what's paper made of? Wood. And we know that wood dust is carcinogenic. It causes cancer, right? So this is another interesting thing. Like, and they say plastics are bad, right? Because they degrade to particles, right? Every solid we know of degrades to particles. Rocks become pebbles, and that becomes sand, and that becomes dust. And paper becomes micro wood particles, and then metal rusts and forms little particles. So how can these people get away with saying plastics are bad because they degrade to particles when every solid on the planet Earth degrades to particles, right? It's just incredible the fiction these people make up, and nobody questions it. It's just illogical. If you do a search for micro metal, for example, right, or micro wood, there is no hit. I tried it on Google. There's no hits for any of these terms. These, what we call microparticles, they're called dust, right? When we see very small particles of wood or paper or skin cells or anything that's degrading, we call it dust. But they made up a special word to make it sound scary. Microplastics. Oh, it must be alien. It must be dangerous. But it isn't when you look at the science.
Interesting. Well, I know when it comes to industry, a lot of industry does acknowledge the challenges and seems to be moving in the direction of trying to at least reduce the, let's say, the impact, the negative impact of plastics. Do you think that they've been pressed by activists, or do you think the people inside of the industry feel that there are some challenges with plastics?
Yeah. There's a few things, right? So if the environmental groups lie to people and they believe plastics are bad, then people say, hey, I want replacement materials. There was a recent report where supermarket executives said, we know that replacing plastic packaging is increasing harm. It means more waste. It means more fossil fuel. It means more CO2, more harm by almost every way you can measure it. We know that we're increasing harm, but because our customers ask for it, we feel compelled to do it. And the politicians are the same. If you tell the public, hey, plastics are bad, we want you to get rid of them. They're like, oh, yippee, votes. I'll do anything for a vote. And off they go. So this is the problem. If you start with misinformation, you end up with really crazy things that increase harm. And that's been one of the most alarming things I found. For example, there's almost 30 life cycle studies to tell you about grocery bags, right? Everyone in the world, apart from one, I found. So of 30, one of them disagrees, but the other ones all agree that the plastic bag, the regular polyethylene bag, is the lowest impact of all the choices. Moving to paper or cotton massively increases harm. It's the same for textiles. Polyester is greener than cotton. And no one, this is all published, right? This is all peer reviewed. It's done according to standards. It's all out there. It's a Google search away. You can literally type in LCA for life cycle analysis, BAG into Google, and you would find these hits now from all over the world. Irrefutable evidence that the plastic bag is greenest, and these people are banning them and putting taxes on them. Why would you? If I had 4 kids, I wouldn't punish only the best behaved one, right? Everything we do has an impact, but we should, as logical people, if we really care, A, spend 3 minutes to check the facts, and B, because it's all like on a web page, you can look up my book for free and it's on the web page for free. All the facts are there with citations to the science. And then pick the thing that has the least impact of the options that we have. If it comes to straws, right, I can't believe the debate over straws. The answer is just don't take a straw. If you have to take one, the plastic one's greenest, that's proven. But just don't take one. It's the same with water bottles. Nobody should be taking plastic or any other kind of water bottles for the most part. Tap water is greener and just fine in most cases. So a lot of it's just about not being as wasteful. But when you do pick a material, pick the greenest one.
Interesting. So you think a plastic straw is greener than a paper straw?
Oh, it is. There's life cycle analysis on it. And you can reuse the plastic one 50 or 100 times. My daughter's done it. So nobody's making us throw this stuff away after one use. And nobody's making us take a straw or a PET bottle either of water. Just drink tap water. That's the funny thing. All the evidence is there and nobody's checking it. They're making too much money by telling lies.
Interesting. What other areas do you see these kind of logical fallacies when it comes to addressing, let's say, climate change? I'm sure it doesn't just apply to plastic. Where are there other sort of logical fallacies?
Outside of the plastics area, there's a couple of them. One of them is women in STEM, right? They're trying to get more women into science. And there are huge peer-reviewed papers on that, right? They did a study with 460,000 people across 67 countries, and they measured scientifically that the more choice you give women, the more freedom of choice they have, the less they want to do science, because women are not as interested as men in science, right? And this has been published. This is a huge studies on this. We know, and it's not social programming, right? In countries with total equality like Sweden and Denmark and Finland, we know, and that's where women choose to do the science the least. And it's the same with men in nursing, right? That's in those countries where people have the most choice. That's where men choose to do nursing the least, because men and women on average are interested in different things. All this science is done, and yet people are driving for these quotas, right? They want 50% women in science. And the irony is the only way you can ever have 50% women in science is to force women to do jobs they're not interested in. What kind of justice would that be? So yeah,
Interesting.
there are these logical fallacies everywhere. I even saw a woman from 3M that she's on this crusade to have 50% women in science. And this quotas idea, true equality is allowing people to do what they want, not forcing them into some numbers game.
And no, I hear you. Now, I have heard that argument from Jordan Peterson before. I
Right.
seem to remember a video
That's right.
with him. It was quite famous. Of course, he is a pretty incredible author, so
He
I'll have
is.
to give him that for sure.
And I've read the original study, so it's all fully backed up. And the interesting thing is this difference in the interest between men and it occurs even with babies, right? So before you can be social programmed, it's the same in babies before they've been exposed to the influence of society. And it's the same in monkeys. They've done studies on monkeys about, on average, what are boy monkeys and female monkeys interested in? And they offer them a toy car or a doll. And on average, the guys take the car and the girls take the doll, right? So it's deep within us. It's a biological thing that we've been programmed with. It's not something that we've been taught by our parents.
Interesting. Yeah, we have evolved for quite a number of hundreds of thousands of years, so that programming is pretty deep in our DNA.
Right.
It's interesting, but so let's go back to climate change. Climate change is a huge area of importance. What are your thoughts on sort of climate change itself and the contribution of materials like plastics and others to climate change?
I don't want to get into the climate change itself because whether humans cause it and all of that stuff. I spent weeks checking that and it was very hard to work out what was going on because the data's been manipulated so many times. If you start with the original data, there's no warming and it's been adjusted so many times, I can't make head or tail of it. But if we look at the influence of materials on CO2, I have the data on that and I have it in front of me. So there's a recent paper which showed that materials creation is responsible for 25% of CO2, right? So manufacturing materials, that's quite a bit. And of that, plastics is a tiny proportion. Metals is most of it by far, and followed by cement. I'm just reading it now off my slide. And then paper, and then plastics is down at the bottom. So of all the CO2 generated, 0.5% is due to plastics. If you were really interested in CO2, you would definitely be more interested in looking at how to get down the numbers for cement and metals and these things which are vastly more impactful than the plastics are. And just because plastics take less energy to produce, you need to burn less fossil fuel to make them. They melt at a couple hundred degrees, whereas metals and glasses take thousands of degrees. They're glowing red hot when you process them, right? So they takes more fossil fuel, takes more energy, takes more. That's something people don't realize. They think that because there's fossil fuel in plastic, it must use more fossil fuel. And that's a fallacy as well. So the overall effect of plastics is to not only reduce CO2 compared to the alternatives by a huge amount, but it's also to net reduce CO2 because although 0.5% of CO2 is created when you make the plastics, reduce CO2 by more than that amount by making vehicles lighter, so you don't burn as much fossil fuel to make them go around, by insulating homes and buildings, and by extending the life of food, so there's not as much food spoilage, because food spoilage is one of the major contributors of CO2. So it amazes me that the green groups, again, will give you these numbers of plastics generate CO2, and the number is incredibly small compared to other materials. And they always forget to say, oh, yeah, but we forgot to mention that plastic actually reduces CO2 by more than that amount, right? It's just incompetent mathematics to only consider one side of the equation and not even look at the CO2 savings from plastics.
No, I hear you on that. Do you feel that it's a good idea to move towards reducing CO2 in the atmosphere?
I don't know. I don't know. I've seen so much data, but I'm not an expert in that area. The thing is, real scientists don't give you opinions when they're not sure and they're not experts on the area. So I don't know enough about that to be sure.
Understand. Yeah, I'll say based on what I've read, it doesn't seem to be a very good thing to put CO2 into the atmosphere. But I agree with you that we have to consider both the costs and the benefits of everything that we do. So when it comes to fossil fuels, for example, we have to look at the benefits of fossil fuels, which are specifically that they're very energy dense, they're cost effective, they help
Mm.
lift people out of poverty. So when we look at that and people that have energy poverty and the ability that fossil fuels give them to master the climate, the number of climate related deaths have plummeted as a
Right.
result of fossil fuel use. Now, that being said, I'm a big proponent of other alternatives to fossil fuels, but they have to be able to deliver the same benefits through technology advancement to be able to also deliver energy dense, cost effective energy for the
Yeah,
globe. So we have to look at the costs and the benefits to that.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
as our group, we're trying to go through all the materials that have a CO2 impact and reduce that impact, but they have to be able to deliver the same value as the original material and the benefits. So when it comes to plastic, we're specifically looking at CO2 free solutions for manufacturing virgin plastic, which we think, to your point, is a net positive because of the way that it reduces the weight when it comes to moving to transportation or to materials. It's lightweight, it's flexible, it's durable. Plastics bring some unique benefits. So I think it is important to remember that value that it brings.
Yeah. Well, as a problem solver, and if I were trying to reduce CO2 and I didn't have unlimited time and unlimited money, I would focus on metals because that's the number one contributor if you're looking at materials. I mean, you could eliminate plastics tomorrow and you wouldn't change the amount of material we're using. In fact, you'd be using more material. It takes on average 3 or 4 pounds of other material to replace 1 pound of plastic. So if you were to remove all plastics tomorrow, it would be bad for CO2, it would be bad for litter, it would be bad for waste, it would be bad for pretty much everything. And you wouldn't have made a dent. So if I were to make an impact, I would start at the things that have the biggest impact, and that's metal and cement, and then followed by paper. Those are all above plastic in terms of the CO2. But this people are just obsessing about plastic. They're doing everything they can about plastic and ignoring the vast majority of everything. It's incredible.
It
People
is.
have got too much passion and they're not checking the facts before they're running off on a crusade before making sure that they're on the right.
I'll give you another side of it. A lot of people are on Bill Gates right now. I've read Bill Gates' book, and the first thing he says is, if somebody comes to me and asks me about CO2, I ask them, what are they going to do about cement? He's rightfully pointing out that cement is a big contributor to GHG, and he's also specifically trying to get at the idea of high temperature heat. So I think one of the challenges with the entire issue around climate change is a complex problem, and people are looking at many different solutions. And so it's diffused our impact by looking at so many different options when we could be focusing on more
Yeah.
specific options. And what I mean by that specifically is fossil fuel works really well, and the reason is because it's energy dense and cost effective. So rather than just try to get rid of all fuel, we should be figuring out, okay, how do we replace fossil fuel with something that doesn't emit CO2? If we could do that, then we work within the existing structure of our economy to be able
Yeah.
to replace it. Now, I think hydrogen is a good alternative. A lot of people that I have on the show disagree because of a variety of reasons. But I think if you have a handful of miracles in hydrogen, you can going to have a very abundant, cost effective, energy dense, zero carbon fuel. And when you do that, you're going to be able to make plastic, you're going to be able to make steel, you're going to be able to make paper, but do it without emitting CO2, which would be ideal.
The person I respect most on that is a guy called Paul Martin, and he's run the numbers, and hydrogen doesn't make sense for most things, according to him. And I'm pretty sure he's right. It makes sense for some things, but it will never make sense for cars. And it's one of these things that's good in theory, but when you actually check the details, it's like for airplanes and things, or cars, it can never work for fundamental reasons that can never be surmounted. And that's my understanding of that.
Yeah, so I have read some of his stuff, but in my view, it's looking at existing technology and not fully taking into account advances and
Yeah,
future technologies that are going to
could
become
be.
available. So it's an
Yeah,
interesting perspective.
yeah. Yeah, as a problem solver, I'd always look at the top three contributors, right? If you look at greenhouse gas, it would be metals and cement and then paper. And if you look at fossil fuel product and use, it would be the same materials because we're burning things to get that energy. And it's the same when you look at waste or materials use. We've got, just pulling up my data here, we got only 0.5% is plastic. So that's not where you would start. So people are spending billions or trillions of dollars and a huge number of man hours doing things that make no impact. In fact, they're making things worse. And so that's frustrating.
Yeah, I know. I hear you. So we've talked a lot about the negative side of this. What's the solution? How do we get to, if we assume that CO2 is bad for the atmosphere, which I know is an assumption for you, but I do think there's enough science around that. How do we get to a solution?
Nuclear. There's a whole book called, what's it called? A Brighter Future or something. And it talks about nuclear. And nuclear is the only proven way to have a better future. The existing nuclear and also advances in nuclear. It's about the only thing that really works and delivers power all year round. Always has to be a big component because these other things are intermittent power. So they give you these big numbers of what the capacity is, but they don't add up because it's not windy that day. Nobody's going to accept having no power for a day or a half a day because the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining enough. So nuclear is the only way to really make things work from the things I've read and what I understand.
I definitely think it's part of the solution. But
Yeah.
again, that's why I'm a fan of hydrogen because of the energy storage component of it and the ability to essentially do what fossil fuels do, which is store energy indefinitely in whatever quantity you want, wherever you want it.
Yeah.
On the cost side, I think that's going to be where you see that the value of something is different depending on where you use it. For
Mm.
example, to go back to the plastics example, if you have a bottle of water, you're going to pay a lot more. You actually pay more for it than a gallon of gasoline. The
Right.
reason you're paying so much is because of the convenience factor and where you're getting it. So
Yeah.
when it comes to the ability to store energy in any quantity for any duration period of time and have that be very energy dense, I think that's what we need is we need a replacement for fossil fuels that doesn't emit CO2.
Mm.
So that's why I'm a big fan of green fuels, because if we're going to make plastic, for example, with net zero, we need some other process, but there has to be a fuel. If there is no fuel, it becomes difficult to do any more than, let's say, handle electricity. Now, nuclear for electricity is a phenomenal solution. I totally
Yeah.
agree with.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I don't know where to start when I start talking about these topics because first of all, there's so much to cover. And also, if you don't cover every area, then people are like, "Oh, but what about this? But what about that?" And that's why I ended up reading so much. So if we look at let's go back to plastics and harm to marine animals, for example, right? So what about the turtles? What about the whales? And this is another trick from these green groups to get your money out of your pocket. There's no surer way to take money out of your pocket than to show some sad picture of a penguin or something like that, or a polar bear. And they've debunked these things again and again. So if you look at whales, for example, right, just go to Google and type whale mortality study, right? And that will take you to peer reviewed papers on what's actually killing whales. Not one mention of the word plastic or bag in any of them. We know exactly what's killing whales, and it's not plastics. It's the same for turtles. It's the same for birds. About 1 billion birds are killed every year in America by cats. So if you actually did care about, and not one by, there's not any statistics on plastics in any of the measurements that they've made because they're either non-existent or so small that they don't even register. So if you actually did care about birds, put a bell on your cat or don't buy a cat. So this is again, if these people genuinely were interested in materials, they wouldn't be focused on plastic because it's 0.5%. If they're interested in CO2, they wouldn't be focused on plastic. If they were interested in waste, they wouldn't be focused on plastic. They would be looking at this other stuff, but they're not. They're demonizing plastic. They're obsessed with plastic, even though it's not doing any of these things that they're claiming. And so it's just ridiculous. And it's profitable for people to perpetuate this myth as well.
I'll have to take the other side on one thing. A lot of people say wind turbines are no good, right? Because they kill birds. But to your point, cats kill a lot more birds than wind turbines do. So I
Wind
think,
turbines are in the statistics. That's 36,000 a year compared to 1 billion from cats and even
yes.
more from running into buildings. So yeah, there are numbers from wind turbines, but to say that's an argument against them is a pretty weak argument when
Yeah.
you look at the stats. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you take both sides of it. That's really good. Chris, we're almost at time here. I didn't give you a chance to talk about your book. What's your book? How can people get it? And what else would you encourage people to read to learn more on this topic?
Yeah. So the book is called Plastics Paradox, and it's free. So you can download that in several languages from either phantomplastics.com or plasticparadox.com. And I made it free because otherwise people are like, well, you're trying to make money from this and blah, blah, blah. And plus I wanted to make it a PDF so you don't have to print paper copies of things. So it is on Amazon if somebody is just dying to have a paper copy, but it's free on the website. The work was all done for free. Nobody's paying me to say any of this. It's a giant waste of my time actually, because I'm up against people with hundreds of millions of dollars of funding who are making money by telling these lies. And this is something I'm doing as a crusade in my spare time, right? This is something I'm doing just because I think we should be making choices based on stuff that's actually true and supported by evidence. That's what I would encourage people to do. I have it all summarized on one page with a video inside called The Great Plastics Distraction Part 2, which you can also find on YouTube. And if you were to watch that, if you genuinely care, then spend 3 minutes to look at the facts and then make up your mind instead of the other way around.
I think that's a fair request, right? You've given your book away for free.
Yeah.
By the way, have you ever read Seth Godin before?
Yeah.
He's a
I've read some.
marketing guy, and it reminds me of him knowing that you're giving the book away for free because that's what he says you're supposed to do is give the book away for free because that way you're able to get that information out there and give people the ability to opt into what you're saying without having to pay. So
Yeah.
hats off
Yeah.
to you for that.
Yeah, I say a couple of things. One is I don't care if people hate plastics as long as they hate them based on something that's actually true. And that's the problem. People are hating plastics based on things which are just wrong. And the other thing I like to say is you can be for the environment or against plastics, but you can't be both at the same time. If you're replacing plastics, you are increasing harm in almost every situation. And if that's something that you want to do, then go ahead and do it. As an adult, you can make your own choices, but don't do it and think you're being virtuous because you're not.
Interesting. So virtue signaling is definitely a hot button for you, I can imagine.
Virtue signaling is a lot more common than actual virtue. Virtue signaling is waving your cotton bag around, feeling great about yourself and looking good, but actually harming the environment. Whereas actual virtue involves spending 5 minutes to check the facts before you make your choice. And
I
it's a good one for you guys. I know there's a recession coming up. People worried about how to afford things. We got rampant inflation and how to be green. How can I afford to be green? And the answer is that the cheapest product is usually the greenest one. So there's no need to choose between being green and saving money because things that make things green in the life cycle analysis are low transportation, low use of fossil fuels, low CO2. All of these using the minimum amount of resources to make something makes it cheap and it also makes it green. So in most cases, the cheapest option is the greenest one as well. And that's another reason why plastics aren't recycled more, because the cheaper something is, the less money you can make recycling it, right? Gold is horrible for the environment. It's horribly expensive and it's always recycled. Nobody throws away gold, right? Or platinum or palladium. They're the worst materials for the environment. and we always recycle them because they're so expensive. And on the other end of that spectrum is polyethylene, which is so green and so cheap that it's barely worth recycling.
So are you saying that free market capitalism is good for the environment?
Looks like it.
It looks like it, right? The way
Yeah.
you're describing it.
Yeah.
There's obviously an argument to be made for that because if you go back to the Middle Ages, everything we did was quite a bit worse for the environment. Fossil fuels obviously have increased our capacity to put CO2 into the atmosphere. And we've also got a lot more people than we did back in those days. But if you took somebody from the Middle Ages and brought them to today, things would feel a lot cleaner and greener and nicer than they did back then. And
Yeah.
that's as a result of capitalism.
Yeah, if you look at the book's Factfulness, what we mentioned earlier before the show by Hans Rosling, and if you look at Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, the world is a better place by almost every metric you can think of in terms of deaths, in terms of the healthcare, in terms of poverty, in terms of deaths by heat related incidents, in terms of almost anything you can measure is far better now than it ever was. But the only way these green groups can get our money out of our pockets is by painting these nightmare scenarios where you have to scare the pants off of people to get their dollars out of their pocket. And so that's the thing. It's another case where the data don't match up with what we're being told online.
Now I hear you. Now I got to stick up for the green groups because a lot of the people I know in some of these groups are solid citizens and they're trying to do the right thing. And they may just be misinformed. And I think that's one of the challenges we have on both sides is the one side paints the other side as having bad intentions and vice versa. Whereas most of the people, we interview a lot of people on this show from both sides. And without exception, everyone who's come on at least has good intentions.
Really?
There may be some misinformation, and I know at the top of certain groups, there may be some bad intentions, but for the most part, the people that I talk to have good intentions on both sides.
Okay. Well, it amazes me. I've written to the World Wildlife Fund and said, hey, stop saying that plastics take hundreds of years to degrade because it's anti-scientific. There's like thousands and thousands of articles on degradation of plastics and how, you know what the world market for plastic stabilizers is? $5 billion a year. Nobody would be spending $5 billion on stabilizers for plastics if they lasted hundreds of years. It's just total nonsense. And I've written to the World Wildlife Fund again and again. I've written to journalists. I've written to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. I've written to Beyond Plastics, Judith Enck, who just told a bunch of nonsense to Congress recently. And none of them care. None of them care to look at the facts. I've never met one of these people who would update what they're saying, more plastic than fish from Ellen MacArthur, an outright lie, and they won't update it. They're making donations on things that have been disproven again and again. So maybe you're meeting a better quality of person than I am, but from what I'm seeing, if they were genuine, they would update their websites according to the information instead of repeating things that have been debunked many times.
I will say that I have heard it said that it's difficult for a scientist to accept anything that might cost him his job. I think that applies on both sides. I do see it when people have a vested interest in something financially. It is difficult, and I think that's just human nature because our brain is a rationalization hamster.
Yeah,
So
I know.
our brain can rationalize anything and convince us that this certain choice is correct, but we're actually doing it out of self-interest. And that's why free market economics works so well,
Yeah.
actually, is because it leverages people's actions based on their own self-interest.
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt is very good at showing that he has the elephant and the rider model of that. So the way that the human brain actually works is that we have a gut reaction, and then we use our logical mind to make up reasons why we already had that gut reaction. So we're not
That's
as
right.
logical as we think we are. I, on the other hand, I'm very logical. The proper way to do things is to go and read 3,000 scientific articles and then make up your mind, not to start off with a preconceived idea and go and find one article that supports it, which is what most people do.
It's tough to do that. I have to admit. I don't know if I would have the time to read that much. So that's why I have to go to people and bring in and synthesize lots of different opinions from different sides just because of the amount of time it takes to truly become an expert on any one. There's a lot of specialization that's needed today.
If I take just that example of degradation, so I saw a wildlife fund this thing. There's a blue picture with all these degradation times on it, and there's no citation to any science. And if you go there to the website, there's no science. If you go to the Greenpeace one, there's no science. There's not one piece of supporting evidence. If you go to my website, you can see tens or hundreds of papers showing that plastics degrade rapidly, right? So it's not even a contest. There is zero science on their side, and nor do they purport to even show any. So it's not even a close call, right? It's just pure fiction, and it's profitable fiction. Whereas on my side, I'm getting paid nothing to show the truth, and the truth is a lot less glamorous.
I'm gonna put a gauntlet down, right? Because You've come on, you've cited your sources. I'd like to have somebody from the other side come on the show and cite their sources. I think, can't believe there's no science on the other side. There has to be.
Zero on
But
that one. Zero.
I don't
Never a
I don't
publication.
know enough to I admit I don't know enough to be able to take the other side of the argument, but I'll say I'd love to have somebody come on that has the other perspective on this one, just so we have a balanced view. But I do have one question for you, and you may not wanna say this thing, but tell me one thing that's bad about plastic.
Yeah, the current recycling rate is too low. And that's for the reasons I just described, that it's a cheap material, which is not that profitable to recycle. It can be done, it can be recycled profitably. We know it's green, but the rate is too low right now. That's one bad thing about it. Another bad thing is they don't last long enough. Green things last forever. If you made one cup and it lasted forever, that would be green because you only spend the energy and the resources once. So that's another problem with plastics. They've spent decades and decades. I've even got a publication on making better stabilizers for plastics to make them last long enough to be even greener than they are now.
Interesting. Yeah. So I think a lot of investors are focused on what they call the circular economy. So you would say on the recycling side, that's an area where people could be spending their money.
Yeah, I'm not that convinced about the circular economy because it's not circular. It's just a fiction. They draw this circle, and I've got a diagram of what it really looks like. Every time you create something into something else, there's a conversion loss of energy, there's new waste created and everything. So this circular economy is another thing that looks great on a piece of paper because the piece of paper diagram is a lie. Paul Martin's the guy who drew the real diagram. He designs chemical plants for a living. He knows exactly what's driving these circles and the fact that you're going to generate new waste, create new messes, which they conveniently ignore. So they're getting, again, billions of dollars based on something that often doesn't make sense. It's often not, it's never circular, and it's often not economical either. And that's something that I see. An argument is that we should use aluminium more, right? Because it's 100% recyclable. And that's not true. A, it's not 100% recyclable. And B, it's horrific for the environment compared to plastic. So the idea that we should take something that happens to be recycled more now and it's circular, instead of taking the thing which is scientifically proven to cause far less harm, but happens to have a too low a recycling rate now, it's wrong. If you choose between what's green and what's circular, you should go with what's green every time.
Interesting.
You should.
I'm actually curious if Paul Martin would agree with you about plastics. Have you ever talked to him?
Yeah, I talked to him once, I think, by phone. Yeah. He's a
Interesting.
logical guy. Just believe the side with the best evidence. That's all there is to it. And anyone who spends a few minutes will see which side that is.
Interesting. Well, I know he's a big believer in electrification, right? So I
Yeah.
actually had somebody on the show who's a colleague of his, and he's a big believer in electrification. And you can't really make plastic unless you have high temperature heat. So you need, and I know it's not as high temperature as steel, but you still need heat to make it. So I'm curious if you could eliminate fossil fuels from the manufacture of plastic. I don't think it's
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah. I would like to say that, and people don't realize this, that the main two plastics are polyethylene and polypropylene, right? They account for about 60% of all plastics. And they're both available from plant based feedstock. You don't have to make them from oil at all. They're both commercially available from plant based feedstock. So that's something that the public is unaware of, that A, it takes less fossil fuel to make the plastics than virtually any other material. And B, you don't have to make them from fossil fuel anyway.
I've come full circle here because we are working on a project where they're going to be making polypropylene from ethanol. And it's a much more environmentally friendly way of doing it. And it costs about the same as doing it from fossil fuels. So that's a really nice, I think, solution. Some of the other solutions we've seen out there cost 5 or 10 times as much as existing plastic. And that just won't work
Yeah.
in
And it's less
for
green.
years. Yeah. It
Yeah.
becomes less green, exactly, because it costs too much.
Yeah. Yeah. I wish that scientists would spend less time trying to get funding and try to glamorize the work that they're doing and more time telling the honest truth to the public, because the public have been misled about many of these things. A lot of these bioplastics are more expensive and less green, proven to be less green than the
We could
regular
talk
ones.
about why that happens. I think that's really happened as a result of social media and the bots that are out there that sort of
Hmm.
elevate certain articles. So when it comes to elevating articles, it was scientifically proven or psychologically proven, you could say. The biggest emotion is outrage.
Yeah.
So there are bots that are out there picking titles for articles and so on. And if they inspire outrage, they get more clicks. So on both sides, we have to recognize that we're being influenced by bots to drive outrageous types of arguments when the
Yeah.
truth usually is in the middle, but it unfortunately doesn't get as many clicks or views.
Well, they've also proven that the truth is 10 or 100 times more work than just making the stuff up in the first place. Refuting nonsense takes a lot more work. But here's a disturbing trend as well. I paid for a list of journalists, environmental journalists at the Wall Street Journal, at the New York Times, at the Washington Post, at the BBC, Reuters, at Bloomberg. I wrote to all of them saying, do you have 3 minutes to look at the facts and cover it? Not one of them wrote back. 30 journalists, a paid list of working emails, none of them interested. I did a post on LinkedIn and said, is there one professional, honorable journalist in the whole of America or even the world who will cover the truth, even look at the truth? 9,000 views, not one email.
Interesting.
There's
Well,
not a journalist who will even look at the facts, right? They're having so much money and making so much money from outrage and repeating nonsense.
so I hope that you go on more shows like this on YouTube and different places so that you can get the word out there. I will say I'll give a shout out to Dow Jones because I do subscribe to the Barron and the Wall Street Journal. And last week, as I mentioned, it was on the cover of Barron's. I will send you the article, and you should reach out to the writer. I don't know her name off the top of my head,
I wrote to her
but
already.
okay, very good. So we'll
Yeah.
see if you can get picked up, and I'll send maybe a clip of this interview to her to see if we can have an honest debate. Because I do think there's a lot to be said for honest debate. I personally believe there's some negatives to plastic, there's some positives, but we have to look at all the preponderance of the evidence, if you will, to come to the
Yeah,
truth.
everything we do has an impact. And I like to quote Winston Churchill. He said, democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the other ones we've tried. And that's exactly what it's the same thing with plastics. That's right. It creates CO2. There's fossil fuel use, blah, blah, blah. But what happens when you replace it? You get 3 to 4 times more waste. You get 4 times more CO2 and fossil fuel use and all the rest of it. So this idea of being against plastic is just too, it's not a holistic picture of what would really happen and compared to what. And that's what people are missing. They're having so much fun and making so much money spreading fiction about plastic. And but as you said, everything has an impact, but we should pick what's having the least impact.
Yep. So I think we can agree on that. And I like the Winston Churchill quote, although I will point out that there's a difference between a pure democracy and a republic, which is what we have here in the States and over there. And I don't think you're calling in from the UK today, but you're originally from the UK. Is that right?
I'm actually American, but I grew up in the UK. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. You've got the British accent. I think that's the ideal. You grew up with, and you're an American, but you have the British accent. I wouldn't mind having that myself. Although I think I like the Australian accent best.
Yeah. I like that too. I like that one too.
It's for
Yeah.
sure.
Well,
Chris,
thanks for
listen,
caring
it's
about the truth, Peter. I really appreciate that. Not many people
I
do.
do. I definitely care about the truth, and we try to take both sides of the argument here. I'm an investment banker, so I try not to get too political. And I'm a big fan of free market economics because I think in the long run, it allows people to make the right choices just simply because it's an incentive structure that, as you
Yeah.
rightly point out, gives people the right to do that with the one caveat that we have to correctly price negative externalities. I think
Mhm.
that's one really nice thing coming out of the whole ESG movement is that there is developing a price mechanism now for negative externalities, which I think is I was taught in economics 101 25 years ago that
Yeah.
negative externalities accounting is a problem.
Okay.
Hopefully we'll be able to get there and come out with a better solution for everybody.
Yeah, I hope so. Great. Thanks for
Well,
having me
Chris,
on. Thanks for
yeah,
the
this
great
has been
questions.
awesome. Chris DeArmitt, you guys definitely check out his book. He's an environmental expert, author. He's an award-winning speaker, a class action expert witness, and he's really dug into the truth about plastics. He brings a fresh perspective that we don't often see and defending something that has actually brought a lot of good to people all over the world. So, Chris, thanks for being on.
Thanks a lot.